Eighth graders, today we're going to do section 11.3, which are equations with exponents. Now remember, we did radical equations in the last section, and we said to undo a square or a square root, we had to square it. Well, today we're doing the opposite thing. We have problems now that start off with x squared. So how do I undo an x squared? Well, I do the opposite, and we learned in the last lesson the opposite of square root is squaring it. So to undo a square, we're going to take the square root of both sides. So taking a look at this problem here, I have the equation x squared equals 16. Well, remember, I want to get the answer down to only x. So I got to get rid of this square. So to undo the square, I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Taking the square root of both sides undoes that square. So that reduces that down to what's underneath the square root sign, which is just my x. And now I need to go through and follow through and take the square root of 16. The square root of 16 is 4. Now here's the thing that's different. Because we're dealing with x squares, we have to take in consideration that we can have a positive 4 and a negative 4 that can make that answer true. Because if I take a positive 4 and square it, what do I get? I get a positive 16. So that's true. But what if I go ahead and take the negative 4 and square that? What do I end up with? I end up with 16 again. So in this case, because we're dealing with an x squared at the very beginning, I have to take in consideration that a positive 4 and a negative 4 can both make that true. Okay, so we're going to make sure that we use this new symbol here, which means positive and negative. That's our shortcut for being able to write both of them. We can get away with putting that symbol instead of just writing a positive 4 and a negative 4. Okay, so use this symbol to help us out today. Okay, so let's see what we can do here. So we're going to go ahead and practice with another problem. This is just taking it up a little bit harder. Look at our equation. My goal is to eventually get it down to x. But before I can take the square root of things, let's combine my like terms. And to combine my like terms, I need to move this over on this side of the equation sign. And so to move it across the equal sign, I need to take the opposite. And the opposite of subtraction is addition. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides. That now gives me with my x squared on one side. And I do my math. Positive 4 and a minus 3 is 1. So now that this is by itself, I can go ahead and take the square root. Okay, so I take the square root of both sides. And I end up with x to one side, and taking the square root of 1 is 1. Now remember, in our equation, I have to, because it's a squared, I have to include the plus or minus. Because in this case, adding a negative 1 squared does give me a positive 1 too. And so I need to take in consideration both of these. So let's go ahead and let's do some practice here. In your notes here, you've got a few equations. And we start off from a very simple looking one to a little bit more complicated as we go. So taking a look at it, remember my goal is to solve for x, so I need to get x by itself. So the very first thing I need to do is get rid of that x squared. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. When I take the square root of x squared, that gives me my x now. And now I just do my math. What is the square root of 81? Square root of 81 is 9. Now remember, because it's the x squared, I can have a positive answer and a negative answer. Make sure you give me that symbol. If you do not give me the symbol, I will have to mark it wrong because you only have half of the answer correct. You've got to have plus or minus 9. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's do this problem here. I need to go ahead and get x squared all by itself, so I need to first move that over. So it's a positive 6, so I'm going to subtract 6, and I'm left with x squared equals 36. Okay, now I need my final answer to just be x, so how do I get rid of that squared? You're right. Take the square root of both sides. When I take the square root of the x squared, I get x. The square root of 36 is 6. And I can't forget, we need to have the plus and the minus for that to be correct. Okay, now this one, we're going to go ahead. I need to get the x squared all by itself, so I need to go ahead and move that negative 3 over. I'm going to take the opposite and add 3 to both sides. That leaves me x squared on this side, and I end up with 25. Now I need to get rid of that x squared so I can just get my x, and what I do to one side, I do the other. So the square root of 25 is 5, and you're right, I need plus or minus for that to be correct. Now this one over here looks different because all my x squared and everything is on the right side. It doesn't matter. We can still treat it the same thing. I need to go ahead and I need to get that 6 over here with this number. So since it's a plus 6, I'm going to subtract 6. 15 minus 6 is 9. I'm left with just x squared on this side. I need to get the x squared out of there, so I need to take the square root of both sides. So now that I'm left with x, the square root of 9 is 3, and I need the plus or minus. So those are the types of problems that we will be working with. Okay, so here's the thing. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead here and show you this number here. Our problems just got a little bit bigger, but it's not anything different, okay? Now, the problem is sometimes when we get an answer, let me show you the final answer here, it is not a whole number, okay? It's not, the square root of 10 is not a perfect square. So we're not going to go ahead and do the decimals. Okay, we're going to leave it in radical form. That is the most accurate way to leave your answer because when I put it in decimal form, I'm going to have to round it at some point. So the most accurate way of doing this is leaving it in radical form. So just like we did the other problems on the other side, I needed to get my x squared by itself. So the very first step here I needed was to move my 12 over here to this side. So since it was negative, I added it. Then my answer was 30. I'm left with 3x squared. I'm still trying to get x squared all by itself. And so since this was multiplied together, I went ahead and I divided both sides. Now I'm left with x squared by itself. And 30 divided by 3 was 10. Now to get my x squared by itself, I had to take the square root of both sides, and I'm left with the square root of 10. Now, even though I'm leaving it in radical form, I still need to do my plus or minus because once I square that, I can still use a positive or a negative. Okay, so let's take a look at this problem here. I have x squared plus 21 equals 12. What do I need to do? I need to move that 21 over here. Now, when I move it over here and do my math, I end up with a negative 9. Okay, I need to go ahead and take the square root of x squared to get x by itself. And when I do that, I end up with plus or minus the square root of 9. Now remember, I can't take square roots of a negative 9. It is an imaginary number that we end up with, or an irrational number. And so in this case here, there is no real solution for it because I cannot take the square root of the negative 9. So go ahead with this type of problem. You need to go ahead and do the whole math problem. You need to still show me plus or minus, and then leave it in the radical form with the negative 9, and then tell me no solution. So there's only no solution when I end up with a negative number underneath the radical sign. So let's do a couple problems here. So if we end up in a situation like the example above, we're just simply going to state no real solution, but we still need to solve it. Okay, so here's my first problem. I need to go ahead and get x squared by itself. So I move my 14 over here, which means I need to add 14. I'm left with x squared equals 43. Now 43 is not a perfect square. So when I take the square root of both sides of this, I'm going to get plus or minus, and I know I need to leave it as square root of 43, because that is not going to be a perfect square when I take the square root of it. Okay, so let's do problem 2 here. Okay, problem 2 is the same thing. I need to get x squared by itself, so I need to move this negative 41 over here. So when I move negative 41 over there, and do my math real quick, 41 minus 17, I end up with 24, and it's negative 24. Okay, and 6x squared. I'm not done yet because I need to get this 6 separated from the x squared. So I'm going to divide both sides by 6, and I end up with x squared equals minus 4. Okay, we're going to go ahead, take the square root of both sides, and I end up with x equals plus or minus. And right away my brain says, oh, we can take the square root of the negative 4. But we can't because it's a negative. So I end up with the square root of negative 4, and that means because of the negative, there is no solution. Okay? So even, we could take the square root of 4. We know that's 2. But because of that negative sign, it switches and turns that into a no solution. So let's go ahead and do this last example here. We're going to go ahead, add the 17. I end up with 5x squared equals 45. Now I need to get this by itself. So I need to divide both sides by 5 again. And I'm left with x squared equals 9. Take the square root of both sides so I can get x by itself. I have plus or minus because it's x squared. And now what is the square root of 9? Square root of 9 is 3. So that is my answer for that. Okay, guys, as you're doing your homework today, be very careful. Solve it using order of operations. Make sure you always include the plus or minus sign. If you don't, that will be wrong. You're only giving me half the answers. Remember, if it is not a perfect square when you take the square root, you need to leave it in radical form. If there is a negative sign underneath the radical sign, that means there is no solution to that. Okay, but you don't know that until you work your way down through the problem and find that negative sign under the radical. Be careful, watch your signs. If you have any questions, text or email me.